Welcome back to Judgment and Decision Making. I'm Dr. Padilla. Now we're going to talk about our new book, Behave. Behave was written in 2017 by Dr. Robert Sapolsky, and he's a professor of biology and neurological sciences at Stanford University. And he was actually one of the inspirations for me to switch from an art focus to cognitive science and behavioral science background. I actually was exposed to his videos on YouTube of lectures, The Biology of Human Behavior, and I found it so fascinating that biology and context and our social environment influences our judgments. If you want to watch some of those lectures, there's a link there. And I'm going to let him introduce this book in his own words.
Give you some sense of this. Okay, so you're in some situation, there's a crisis. There's rioting, violence going on, people running around, and there's a stranger running at you in an agitated state. And you can't quite be sure what their facial expression is. Maybe they're angry, maybe they're frightened, maybe it's threatening. They've got something in their hand that seems like a handgun, and you're standing there and you have a gun and they come running at you and you shoot. And then it turns out that what they had in their hand was a cell phone instead. And thus we ask a biological question: why did that behavior occur in you? And what's really the central point is that's a whole hierarchy of questions. Why did that behavior occur? What went on 1 second before in your brain that brought about that behavior? Now, to begin to understand that, the part of the brain that's at the top of the list of usual suspects is a brain region called the amygdala. You want to think about aggression and think about the brain, you think about the amygdala. If you stimulate the amygdala in an experimental lab animal, you get an outburst of aggression. Humans who have rare types of seizures that start there, rare types of tumors based on the amygdala, uncontrollable violence. If you damage the amygdala, you blunt the ability of an organism to be aggressive. Okay, so the amygdala is about violence. Except if you sit down your typical amygdalologist and ask them what the amygdala is about, that's not the first word that's going to come out of their mouths. Because for most people studying it, what the amygdala is about is fear. Fear and anxiety and learning to be afraid. In other words, we've just learned something very interesting, which is you cannot understand the first thing about the neurobiology of violence without understanding the neurobiology of fear. And a world in which no amygdaloid neuron need be afraid, there'd be an awful lot more of us sleeping between lions and lambs. Okay, so we've gotten a sense of a couple of the brain regions here that are pertinent. So that's what's going on in 1 second before. But no brain is an island, and what we now have to do is take a step back. So what was going on in the seconds to minutes before in the sensory environment, which triggered that amygdala to do this, or that frontal cortex to do that? What are the stimuli that are coming in there? Now, obviously, in this scenario, we have the sight, the sounds of this rioting perfectly pertinent to making sense there. But then there's a whole world of sensory stuff going on that's subliminal, that you hardly even know is there. And if you did, not in a million years would you think it's pertinent. For example, when you have to make split-second decisions, you are more likely to mistake a cell phone for a handgun if the person holding it is male, is large, is of another race. Your brain processes that in 50 milliseconds. That is 1/20th of a second. Your brain is already distinguishing that incorrectly. Why is that? That turned out to have a really interesting piece of the wiring of the amygdala. Okay, so suppose you look at somebody and there's something in their hand that's either a cell phone or a handgun. So what happens? The information goes from your eye to this way station in the brain and eventually gets to your visual cortex. And a first layer there sits and spends some time and figures out what the pixels are. And then the second layer turns the pixels into lines. And then the next layer turns the lines into curves. And eventually you got a four-dimensional sort of picture of whatever. And then eventually some neurons in your cortex says, oh my, I believe that's a handgun, and let's go wake up the amygdala and let it know about it. That's the simple part. It turns out there's a shortcut. The very first way station where sensory information comes in shortcuts directly to the amygdala. In other words, the amygdala knows there's a handgun while your visual cortex is still futzing around with the pixels there. That's very good. That's very helpful that it gets that information quickly. But it turns out you need all those computational layers in your visual cortex to tell what's there accurately. In other words, the amygdala gets sensory information that's very emotionally aroused before your conscious cortex does, and the accuracy is not great. And thus, if you're tired, if you're hungry, if you're in pain, if there's a bad smell around, if any of those things are happening, you are biasing the amygdala towards mistaking a neutral facial expression for a threatening one, mistaking a cell phone for a handgun, all of that occurring in the seconds before. Now, historically, probably the single biggest horror in terms of American consciousness from the Vietnam War was the My Lai massacre. A brigade of American soldiers went into an undefended village full of civilians and killed between 350 and 500 of them, gang raped women and girls beforehand, mutilated bodies, utterly nightmarish because it occurred, because the U.S. government covered it up for as long as possible, because ultimately they just did slapping of a few wrists, and because it was not a singular incident, it was one of the nightmares of the Vietnam War. The My Lai massacre was stopped by one man, a man named Hugh Thompson. Thompson was piloting a helicopter gunship, flying over the village, and was seeing American soldiers firing activity. Oh, they're under attack by Viet Cong, landed there, got out, and was viewing the incomprehensible sight of American soldiers shooting elderly women, digging out babies from underneath the bodies of their mothers and shooting them, and figured out what was happening. And Hugh Thompson got into his helicopter and in the course of minutes undid every bit of training he had had as to who is an us and who is a them. He took his helicopter, landed it between the last group of surviving villagers there, and American soldiers coming at them with their weapons, landed his helicopter and turned his machine guns on the American soldiers and said, "If you do not stop, I will mow you all down." And what is most important to me is none of these guys had fancier neurons than any of us. Same neurotransmitters, same genes, same enzymes, no fancier than any of us. What I think we're left with here at the end is a version of like that inevitable, exasperating cliche, those who don't study history are destined to be able to repeat it. What we have here, I think, is the opposite. Those who don't study the history of extraordinary human change, and those who don't study the science of how we more readily go from the worst of our behaviors to the best ones, are destined not to be able to repeat unbelievable, magnificent moments like these.
As you may have noticed, there's a variety of new terms that he's introducing. The biggest one is behavior. He refers to this term behavior, action. It really means decision making. You can think of those two synonymously with one another. Now, he also kind of throws out lots of these neuroscience terms. There's no need for you to memorize these terms. This isn't a neuroscience class, but you'll hear many of these terms come up throughout the book. And you'll hear some of them in the lectures as well. So I want you to have just a brief understanding of what they are. The first one is a neuron, which is the basic unit of the nervous system. It's essentially one of the smallest components in the brain, and it's how our entire brain functions. The next is a neurotransmitter, which is a molecule used by the nervous system to transmit messages between neurons or from neurons to muscles, sort of the communication system within the brain. The next is the amygdala. It's the brain region associated with aggression and competition. Now, we've already talked a little bit about the amygdala, and it will come up a lot more throughout the course of these next few lectures. The frontal cortex, which is associated with type 2 processing, planning, attention, and overrides type 1. It's generally the part of the brain that's highly active when we stop ourselves from doing something automatic and instead do some more planned, careful, controlled activity. Hormones. This is something entirely new that this book references a lot. And there's a lot of different hormones that Sapolsky writes about. Here's just a sampling of them. And as we go through the chapters, I'll do some more in-depth discussion of what each of these are. But first, progesterone is the general hormone associated with the connection between mother and child. During pregnancy and during childbirth, lots of progesterone is released. which helps the mother bond with the child and helps the child identify who the mother is. And this happens with humans and a variety of other species. The next is testosterone. Many of you may think you know what testosterone is. Generally, people think it's associated with aggression, highly male dominance activities. While that is the case, testosterone, like all hormones and all components of the brain, is very context dependent. So testosterone actually really functions the most in circumstances where someone needs to perform for a goal. So if there's a war and you need to be very aggressive, that's when people with high testosterone tend to show those aggressive activities. But if you're in a competition where the person who succeeds the most is the most compassionate or does the most sharing or team building, the people with high testosterone will engage in sharing or collaborative activities when those are associated with better outcomes. So it's really more about performing for a goal, not just pure aggression. The next is dopamine. Dopamine is generally thought to be this feeling of euphoria, this hit that you get of positive feelings that you get a lot with different types of drugs. It's also what tends to be overtaxed when you start to take too many drugs. Your dopamine receptors tend to get kind of worn down or less responsive over time. Oxytocin is really the love hormone. It is what helps us connect with people and have positive feelings in relationships. Last one, serotonin. Serotonin is generally understood to be associated with happiness, and researchers have studied it extensively to determine if individuals with depression are lacking in serotonin on some capacity. Summary here, Behave introduces how biology also contributes to our decision making. The first book we talked about, Thinking Fast and Slow, focused on different components in the mind, how the mind functions. The next book, Nudge, really focused on how environmental factors influence our judgments. And this third book focuses more on biology, how biology, in addition to those other components, really influences how we make our decisions in the world. For the purposes of this class, we'll focus on concepts rather than memorization/testing of terms. While I just told you about those different terms, and there's lots of terms in the book, it's a very dense chapters, as you will notice. No need to memorize those terms. You won't be tested on those. Finally, biology works on all levels, from genes to muscle movement, in combination with environmental context to influence our decisions. That's to say that everything from our DNA, our genes, all the way up to the actions that we take is influenced by our biology, and that impacts our decisions as well. Now, to close, I just want to suggest that these chapters will be a little bit more dense than the readings that we've done in the past. This is why you only have to read 2 chapters per week, so you have more time to digest that information. And I hope you will find it as enjoyable as I do.